At 3 in the morning local time, deep inside a stretch of pine forest, roughly 40 miles from the Crimean border, a Russian fuel storage base sat quiet under a layer of camouflage netting that had taken engineers the better part of 2 years to perfect. From the air, at a casual glance, the site looked like nothing more than an abandoned logging depot, a scattering of rusted equipment and overgrown access roads leading nowhere important. That impression was exactly the point. Beneath the netting and the deliberately neglected surface dressing sat 22 underground storage tanks holding close to 40,000 tons of diesel and aviation fuel, the single largest reserve feeding Russian air operations and mechanized units across the entire Crimean peninsula. Whoever controlled that fuel controlled how far Russian aircraft could fly, how long Russian tank columns could maneuver, and how quickly reinforcements could reach any threatened stretch of the front. It was, in every sense that mattered, one of the most valuable pieces of ground in the entire southern theater of the war, and almost nobody outside a small circle of planners was supposed to know it existed at all. Ukraine had known about it for months. What Ukrainian intelligence had not been able to confirm until recently was the base's internal layout, the exact placement of its access roads, its power supply, and most importantly, the location of its air defense umbrella. That last detail mattered more than anything else. A fuel base without functioning air defense is an open target. A fuel base ringed by layered air defense, backed by electronic warfare and rapid reaction infantry, is something else entirely, a fortress disguised as a forest. For weeks, a single reconnaissance drone had been quietly mapping the site from high altitude, using a long-endurance airframe capable of loitering for hours at a time, while transmitting only in short, irregular bursts designed to avoid drawing attention. Slowly, piece by piece, the picture came together. 4 surface-to-air missile positions arranged in a rough diamond pattern around the perimeter. 2 electronic warfare vehicles stationed at opposite corners of the compound, positioned to create overlapping fields of jamming coverage. A rapid reaction infantry platoon housed in a low concrete building near the main access road, equipped with man-portable air defense systems and heavy machine guns mounted on technical vehicles. And beneath all of that, the storage tanks themselves, buried just deep enough to survive a glancing strike, but not deep enough to survive a direct hit from a warhead built to punch through reinforced concrete. The strike planners understood immediately that a conventional approach would fail. Sending a large formation of attack drones in a single wave against a target, this well-defended would simply hand the Russian air defense crews exactly the kind of engagement they had trained for. Multiple radar-visible targets approaching from a predictable direction, easy to prioritize and destroy one at a time. Instead, the plan that emerged relied on timing, deception, and a staged sequence of smaller strikes designed to collapse the base's defenses, layer by layer rather than all at once. It was less like a single hammer blow and more like a series of precisely placed incisions, each one designed to open a path for the next. The operation began not with drones at all, but with silence. 3 days before the strike, Ukrainian electronic intelligence units began quietly recording the base's normal patterns of radio traffic, radar sweep intervals, and shift change routines. Every military installation, however disciplined, develops habits, and habits are predictable. The night shift at the base rotated at 11, changing over with a brief window during which sentries at the outer perimeter were sometimes distracted by the changeover itself. The base's primary search radar, an older system nearing the end of its service life, showed a slightly longer blind interval between sweeps than the manual suggested it should, likely the result of years of use and deferred maintenance. None of these details individually meant much. Together, they formed a narrow window of opportunity, a few minutes each night when the base's attention was fractionally diverted and its radar coverage fractionally thinner than usual. At 2:57 in the morning, 4 minutes before the planned strike, a single small reconnaissance drone lifted off from a position roughly 8 miles from the base, flying low and slow along a dry riverbed that offered natural cover from ground-based radar. Its job was not to attack anything. Its job was to act as a lightning rod, drawing the base's electronic warfare systems into activating early, revealing their exact positions, and forcing the defenders to commit resources to tracking a threat that, in reality, posed no danger at all. The bait worked almost immediately. As the decoy drone crossed into the outer edge of the base's detection envelope, one of the 2 electronic warfare vehicles powered up its jamming suite, flooding the surrounding frequencies with noise in an attempt to sever any control link the intruding drone might be using. The vehicle's own emissions, in doing so, gave away its exact position to a separate Ukrainian reconnaissance asset, monitoring the electromagnetic spectrum from a concealed position nearly 6 miles away. Within 90 seconds, that position had been logged, cross-referenced against earlier surveillance, and confirmed. At exactly 3 in the morning, the real strike began, and it did not begin with the storage tanks at all. It began with a jamming vehicle that had just revealed itself. A single loitering munition, essentially a small drone built around an explosive warhead rather than a camera and control system meant for return flights, had been pre-positioned nearly 2 miles from the base, holding a low racetrack pattern over a stretch of empty farmland, while it waited for exactly this moment. The instant the jamming vehicle's position was confirmed, the loitering munition broke from its holding pattern and accelerated directly toward the coordinates it had just been given, using the same kind of rapid, tightly compressed data burst that had proven effective in previous strikes elsewhere along the front, a transmission lasting well under a second, difficult to intercept, and even more difficult to trace back to its source in the time available. The jamming vehicle's crew had no warning. Their own system, designed to detect and disrupt incoming drone control signals, was tuned to catch continuous transmissions, not a single fragment of data too brief to register as a coherent threat. The loitering munition covered the remaining distance in under 90 seconds, guided in its final approach not by a live human operator but by its own onboard optical recognition system, which had been given a reference image of exactly this type of vehicle during pre-mission planning. It struck the jamming vehicle directly, the explosion tearing through the antenna array and disabling the system before its operators fully understood what had happened. In a single strike, 1/4 of the base's electronic warfare coverage had been removed from the board. The remaining jamming vehicle, stationed at the opposite corner of the compound, immediately increased its own output, attempting to compensate for the gap left by its destroyed counterpart. That decision, while tactically sound in isolation, created a new vulnerability. With only one jamming source now covering the entire perimeter, the density of its coverage in any single direction necessarily thinned. Ukrainian planners had anticipated exactly this response, and a second wave of drones, this one a formation of 6 small attack drones flying in a loose, staggered pattern rather than a tight group, approached from the direction where the remaining jamming vehicle's coverage was weakest, timed to arrive just as the system was still adjusting to its increased workload. The base's radar picked up this second wave almost immediately, and the diamond pattern air defense positions began responding within seconds. Surface-to-air missile crews scrambled to acquire targets, radar operators called out bearings, and 2 of the incoming drones were destroyed in short order by missiles fired from the nearest defensive position. That was, in a strange way, exactly what the attacking side had expected and even hoped would happen. The 6 drones in that formation were never intended to all survive. 4 of them carried no explosive payload at all, stripped down to bare frames and cheap onboard cameras, functioning purely as decoys meant to draw missile fire and force the defenders to reveal the precise engagement envelope of their surface-to-air systems, how quickly they could acquire a target, how far out they could intercept, and how many missiles remained loaded and ready after the first exchange. The remaining 2 drones in that formation, the only ones actually carrying warheads, adjusted their flight paths the instant the first missile launches were detected, dropping to a lower altitude and altering their approach vector to avoid the engagement envelope that had just been mapped out in real time by the sacrifice of their decoy counterparts. One of the 2 survived long enough to reach the perimeter fence line before being struck down by automatic weapons fire from the rapid reaction infantry platoon, its warhead detonating harmlessly against open ground well short of anything valuable. The other made it further, skimming low along a service road that ran between 2 of the missile positions, using the terrain and the confusion of the ongoing engagement to mask its approach. Its target was not the storage tanks themselves but the base's primary search radar, the aging system with the known gap in its sweep coverage. The drone struck the radar dish directly, collapsing the antenna structure and blinding the base's ability to track any further incoming threats through conventional means. With the radar down and one of 2 jamming vehicles destroyed, the base's layered defense had been reduced, in the space of roughly 4 minutes, to a single remaining jamming system, a rapid reaction infantry platoon still working from partial information, and 3 of 4 original surface-to-air missile positions, several of which had already expended a portion of their available missiles engaging decoys that had posed no real threat at all. It was, from the perspective of the base commander scrambling to understand what was happening, an increasingly desperate picture, made worse by the fact that communication with higher command had been degraded by the same electronic disruption that had briefly flared up earlier in the engagement, leaving local officers to make decisions. With incomplete information about the true scale and intent of the attack, the main strike force, held back until this point specifically to exploit whatever gaps the earlier waves managed to create, now moved forward. 12 drones, each carrying a thermobaric warhead specifically selected for its effectiveness against buried fuel storage, approached from the northeast, the one direction where the base's remaining radar coverage had never been fully restored since the earlier strike against the primary search system, flying at low altitude and staggered intervals to avoid presenting a single easily engaged formation. The drones closed the final distance while the base's surviving defenses attempted, with limited success, to reorganize under pressure. The remaining jamming vehicle attempted to blanket the approach corridor with disruption, and for a stretch of nearly a minute, the operators controlling the strike force lost clear video from several of the drones simultaneously, the picture dissolving into the same kind of fragmented static that had become a familiar hazard in earlier operations along this front. As in previous engagements, the drones did not depend entirely on a continuous human link to complete their mission. Each carried an onboard recognition system trained specifically to identify the distinctive access hatches, ventilation stacks, and surface markers that indicated the presence of underground fuel storage, allowing them to continue toward pre-identified target points even without a stable connection to their operators. One drone, its Link severed completely for nearly 40 seconds, emerged from the jamming corridor still tracking correctly toward its assigned target, guided entirely by what its own camera and processing system could recognize on the ground below. 2 drones were lost to a hastily repositioned surface to air missile crew that managed, despite the chaos, to reacquire a partial radar picture and fire on the approaching formation, destroying both before they reached the perimeter. A third was brought down by concentrated small arms fire from infantry positions that had moved forward, from their original defensive posture to cover the gap left by the destroyed radar system. The remaining 9 continued their approach, spreading out to strike multiple points across the tank farm almost simultaneously rather than concentrating on a single location, a deliberate choice meant to prevent any single successful containment effort from limiting the overall damage. The first detonation struck a surface access hatch above one of the larger underground tanks, and the thermobaric warheads blast wave traveled downward through the access shaft with far greater destructive effect than a conventional explosive would have managed against a buried target of that depth. Within seconds, secondary detonations began as the initial blast ignited fuel vapor that had begun venting upward through the damaged access point, and a column of fire rose from what had, only moments earlier, appeared from the outside to be nothing more than an unremarkable patch of forest floor. The remaining 8 drones struck in a rapid, staggered sequence over the following 90 seconds, each targeting a different section of the tank farm to prevent firefighting crews from concentrating their response on any single point of failure. By the time the last of the 9 warheads detonated, fires had broken out across roughly 2/3 of the storage site, and the underground network of pipes connecting individual tanks had begun failing under the combined heat and pressure, spreading burning fuel through sections of the facility that had not been directly struck at. All firefighting teams stationed at the base, trained primarily for conventional above-ground fuel fires, found themselves facing a scenario closer to an uncontrolled underground inferno, with access points to several of the burning tanks either destroyed outright or rendered too dangerous to approach due to the risk of further secondary explosions. By dawn, satellite imagery and drone footage circulating among open-source analysts showed a column of black smoke rising thousands of feet into the air, visible from towns many miles away, and thermal imagery indicated that fires continued burning at the site for the better part of 2 full days before firefighting crews, reinforced by additional units brought in from surrounding areas, finally managed to bring the last of the flames under control. Early assessments suggested that somewhere between half and 2/3 of the base's total fuel reserve had either burned outright or been rendered unusable due to contamination and structural damage to the storage tanks themselves, a loss that removed, in a single night, a meaningful fraction of the total fuel available to support Russian air and ground operations across the entire Crimean sector for weeks to come. In the minutes immediately following the last detonation, the base's surviving command structure faced a problem that no amount of prior planning had fully prepared them for. Standard procedure called for an immediate damage assessment, followed by a request for reinforcement, additional air defense assets, and firefighting support from the nearest logistics hub roughly 25 miles away. But the same communication degradation that had briefly affected the base during the earlier stages of the attack made even that basic reporting process slower and less reliable than it should have been. Officers on site were forced to rely on runners and short-range handheld radios to coordinate an initial response, a level of improvisation that would have seemed almost unthinkable at a facility of this supposed strategic importance only a few hours earlier. By the time a clear picture reached higher command roughly 40 minutes after the first detonation, several additional tanks had already begun to fail structurally under the combined heat, and any hope of containing the fire to the sections originally struck had effectively disappeared. Reinforcements did eventually arrive. A mixed convoy of firefighting vehicles and additional air defense crews sent from the nearest garrison, but their approach itself became complicated by the ongoing chaos at the site. Roads leading into the facility had not been designed to handle heavy vehicle traffic converging from multiple directions simultaneously, and the smoke column rising from the burning tanks reduced visibility along the final approach to the point where several vehicles were forced to slow to a crawl, worried about running into debris or damaged infrastructure they could not clearly see. It took nearly 2 hours for a fully coordinated firefighting effort to begin in earnest, and by that point, the fire had already consumed a significant portion of what it was eventually going to consume, regardless of how quickly help arrived. This delay illustrates a secondary vulnerability that strikes of this kind expose beyond the immediate physical destruction. Even well-defended, well-resourced installations depend on functioning command and communication systems to respond effectively to an ongoing crisis, and an attack that degrades those systems even briefly can extend the practical consequences of an initial strike far beyond what the raw explosive damage alone would suggest. Open-source analysts and independent observers tracking the aftermath in the days that followed noted a pattern that has become increasingly familiar throughout this stage of the conflict. Commercial satellite imagery, made available to researchers and journalists within roughly a day of the strike, showed extensive scorching across a wide section of the facility, consistent with reports of fires burning for an extended period rather than being contained quickly. Thermal imagery captured by orbiting satellites in the hours after the strike showed hotspots consistent with continued underground burning, suggesting that fuel trapped within the damaged pipe network beneath the facility continued to feed the fire from below, even after visible flames on the surface had been brought under control in certain sections. Analysts comparing this event to previous strikes against similar infrastructure elsewhere along the front noted that the staged multi-wave approach used here appeared more methodical and more clearly sequenced than in several earlier attacks, suggesting a level of planning and rehearsal that likely reflected lessons learned from previous operations that had achieved more limited success against comparably defended targets. The strategic consequences of an operation like this extend well beyond the immediate loss of fuel and infrastructure. A storage base of this size exists specifically because it allows a military force to stockpile reserves during periods of relative calm, building a buffer that can absorb the strain of sustained operations without requiring constant, vulnerable resupply convoys traveling long distances across contested territory. When that buffer is destroyed, the underlying vulnerability it was designed to hide reappears immediately. Units that had been drawing fuel from a large, centralized, relatively secure reserve suddenly find themselves dependent once again on smaller, more exposed supply routes, the very kind of vulnerable convoys that have proven time and again to be extraordinarily difficult to protect from exactly the kind of drone strikes this base had been built to help avoid. There is also a psychological and organizational cost that tends to receive less attention than the physical damage itself. A base that had been considered secure enough to house 40,000 tons of critical fuel, hidden beneath camouflage netting and protected by a layered air defense network, had just been proven vulnerable in spectacular fashion. Visible for miles and impossible to conceal from either side of the conflict or from independent observers tracking the smoke plume from a considerable distance. Military planners on the defending side now face a difficult choice. They can attempt to rebuild an equivalent centralized reserve at the same location, investing heavily in additional air defense and accepting the risk that whatever vulnerabilities allowed this strike to succeed might still exist. Or they can disperse future fuel storage across a larger number of smaller, less individually valuable sites, sacrificing the efficiency of centralized storage in exchange for a reduced single point of failure, an approach that inevitably increases the complexity and cost of maintaining adequate supply across the entire region. From the attacking side's perspective, this operation illustrates a pattern that has become increasingly common in this stage of the conflict. Rather than attempting to overwhelm a well-defended target with a single large wave of drones, successful strikes increasingly rely on a staged sequence of smaller, purpose-built waves, each one designed to strip away a specific layer of defense before the main strike force ever commits to its final approach. Decoy drones without warheads serve a purpose entirely distinct from their explosive counterparts, deliberately sacrificed not to cause damage, but to force the defending side to reveal engagement ranges, missile inventories, and radar coverage gaps that would otherwise remain hidden until the moment they mattered most. Electronic warfare systems, rather than being treated as an obstacle to rout around, became targets in their own right, specifically prioritized early in the engagement because disabling them created cascading vulnerabilities across every other layer of the base's defense. This kind of layered, sequential approach to overcoming a heavily defended target requires a level of coordination and planning considerably more involved than a single mass drone strike. But it also produces results that a simpler approach likely could not achieve against a target this well protected. Each wave in the sequence existed specifically to make the next wave more likely to succeed, and the final strike against the storage tanks themselves only became possible because the radar, one jamming vehicle, and a significant portion of the base's missile inventory had already been neutralized or expended in the preceding minutes. It is a style of warfare that trades simplicity for effectiveness, accepting higher complexity and a longer overall engagement window in exchange for a dramatically improved chance of neutralizing a target that a single wave of drones would likely have failed to penetrate at all. It also reflects a broader economic reality that has increasingly shaped this conflict. The base destroyed in this operation represented a substantial, long-term investment, underground storage infrastructure, a layered air defense network, dedicated electronic warfare vehicles, and a trained infantry garrison, all built and maintained specifically to protect a resource whose value ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The attacking force, by contrast, expended a total of roughly 20 small and medium-sized drones across the entire operation, a combined cost that likely represented only a small fraction of the value of the fuel destroyed, to say nothing of the destroyed radar system, jamming vehicle, and the missiles expended engaging decoys that never posed any genuine threat. That kind of exchange rate, a modest investment and low cost, partially expendable drones producing losses many times greater in value on the defending side, has become one of the defining features of how this stage of the war has been fought. And it raises difficult questions for any military planner about how much can realistically be spent defending fixed infrastructure against an opponent willing to accept the loss of a significant fraction of an attacking force in order to guarantee that a handful of drones eventually reach their intended target. There is a further dimension to this exchange rate that deserves attention, one that goes beyond simple cost comparisons between drones and fuel. A base of this size represents years of accumulated planning, construction, and logistical integration into the broader military supply network supporting operations across Crimea and the surrounding region. Replacing the physical infrastructure, the underground tanks, the pipe networks, the access roads, is a matter of months at best, assuming materials, labor, and security conditions allow reconstruction to proceed without further interruption. Replacing the accumulated fuel reserve itself is a separate and in some ways more immediate problem, since fuel of this quantity does not simply appear on demand, but must be transported, often along the very routes and through the very choke points that have proven vulnerable to exactly this kind of interdiction campaign elsewhere along the front. In that sense, the destruction of a facility like this does not just erase a static quantity of stored resources. It forces planners to once again rely on the transport routes this base was specifically built to reduce dependence on, reintroducing exactly the kind of exposure that centralized storage was meant to eliminate in the first place. Beyond the immediate tactical and economic dimensions, there's a deeper pattern worth considering about how quickly both sides in this conflict have adapted their approach to drone warfare in response to each other's innovations. Electronic warfare systems that once represented a near-total defense against remotely piloted drones have been increasingly countered by onboard recognition systems capable of completing a mission even after losing contact with a human operator. Layered air defense networks built to engage incoming threats efficiently have been increasingly targeted by decoy waves, specifically designed to exhaust their resources and reveal their operational parameters before the actual strike ever begins. Centralized, heavily defended infrastructure, once considered the safest way to protect critical resources like fuel, has become an increasingly attractive target precisely because its size and value make the investment required to destroy it worthwhile, even against a formidable defensive network. It is also worth considering how an operation of this scale fits into the broader pattern of strikes against fuel and logistics infrastructure that has developed over the course of the conflict. Early in the war, attacks against fixed installations of this kind tended to rely on a much smaller number of larger, more expensive precision weapons, munitions that were effective when they connected but existed in limited supply and could not be produced or replaced quickly enough to sustain a high tempo of operations against multiple targets simultaneously. The shift toward large numbers of comparatively inexpensive drones, some of them true attack platforms and others functioning purely as decoys, reflects a deliberate adaptation to that earlier limitation. Rather than depending on a small number of exquisite weapons that had to succeed on the first attempt, this newer approach accepts a higher rate of individual failure across dozens of expendable systems in exchange for a much greater overall probability that enough of them will get through to accomplish the mission. That shift has consequences that extend well beyond any single engagement. It changes what kind of targets become worth attacking in the first place, since a heavily defended but sufficiently valuable target that would have been considered too costly to risk expensive precision weapons against may still be worth attacking, using a much larger number of low-cost systems, provided planners are willing to accept that a meaningful fraction of those systems will likely be lost along the way. It also changes what kind of defenses are considered adequate. A base defended well enough to reliably intercept a handful of expensive precision weapons might still prove vulnerable to a much larger, more complex wave of low-cost drones specifically designed to exhaust exactly those defenses before the strike that matters most ever arrives. This has forced defending forces on both sides of the conflict to reconsider not just how many air defense systems they station at a given location, but how those systems are postured, how much of their available inventory they commit early against what might be decoys, and how quickly they can identify a genuine threat within a much larger and more confusing volume of incoming traffic than earlier defensive doctrine had generally anticipated. Facilities that once might have been considered adequately protected by a modest air defense detachment increasingly require a far more layered, redundant approach, one capable of absorbing the loss of any single system, whether that is a radar, a jamming vehicle, or a missile battery, without the entire defensive structure collapsing as a direct result. None of this suggests that the outcome of any individual engagement is predetermined, or that a base defended in this manner is doomed to fail regardless of the specific circumstances. Different terrain, a different sequence of defensive decisions, additional air defense reserves held in reserve rather than committed early, or simply a different level of alertness among the crews on duty that particular night could easily have produced a very different result. What operations of this kind do demonstrate consistently is the direction in which this style of warfare has been evolving. Success increasingly depends not on the raw number of drones committed to an attack, nor solely on the sophistication of any single piece of technology involved, but on how effectively an attacking force can sequence multiple waves, each with a distinct and limited purpose to progressively dismantle a much larger defensive system before committing the resources that actually need to survive the engagement. Whether the single most decisive element of this particular strike was the early sacrifice of decoy drones used to map out the base's true defensive capabilities, the deliberate early targeting of the electronic warfare vehicles that would otherwise have blinded the later waves, or the choice to strike the underground storage tanks from multiple directions simultaneously rather than concentrating on a single point, remains a question worth considering carefully. Each of those decisions built directly on the ones that came before it, and it is difficult to imagine the final strike succeeding as thoroughly as it did if any single earlier phase of the operation had failed. What do you think mattered most in an operation like this? The deception used to draw out the base's defenses, the resilience of the drones that kept functioning even after losing contact with their operators, or the decision to strike multiple points across the target at once rather than committing everything to a single location? There is rarely a single clean answer to that kind of question, and that may be exactly the point worth taking away from an engagement like this one. Modern strikes against heavily defended, high-value targets do not usually succeed because of one brilliant idea executed in isolation. They succeed because a series of smaller decisions, each one reasonable and limited in scope on its own, are sequenced together in a way that compounds their effect far beyond what any single element could have achieved alone. Share your thoughts in the comments. Goodbye.